ongoing series of introductory talks. So we're going to do short introductory talks, or at least try to, at Exchange.js meetups. And so we're also looking for people who are willing to give short introductory talks. So this one will be a short introduction to functions and scope. So first of all, what are functions? Functions in JavaScript are basically blocks of code that you can call again and again and again. Usually you give them a name, and then that allows you to invoke them many times. They're also a way of organizing your code. Basically, things that belong together can be put into one function such that you can put that abstraction in one little block and call it later repeatedly. So here's a very simple function right here. We use the directive function, and then we give it a name. I've got a 1, and then it's got open paren, close paren, open curly brace, and then a closed curly brace, and inside is called the body. Okay? Here, I have it actually return a value, and it just returns 1. So every time you call this function, it's just going to return 1. So that's relatively simple. To invoke that function, you just go ONE, open paren, close paren, semicolon. And that will just invoke it and waste that value of an expression because you didn't assign it to anything. This return value means that any invocation of the function will actually return a value. Okay? So if it hits that block of code inside that function, it will return. Functions can also take parameters. So this is an example of a one parameter function, and it's called function. We've given it a short name f, and it has one parameter x. Inside the function, we can manipulate x. Okay? So right there, we're multiplying by 2 and then returning that value. That means that if we apply a number to this function, say f of 2, it will run this expression. So it will basically make a new scope. It will assign 2 to x within that scope, an x just for that scope. And then it will go 2 times the value of x. And in this case, we've already assigned 2 to it, so it's going to be 2 times 2, which will be equal to 4. Okay? So functions allow us to provide parameters such that if something changes within the function, we can provide values that represent that part that changes. We also don't need to name functions if we don't want to. JavaScript enables us to basically create functions as an object and assign them. And we don't need to provide the name for every function. So if you write the word function and you immediately follow it by parentheses, you're basically making what's called an anonymous function. This function has not been given a name yet. Okay? So this is quite useful because sometimes you don't have a good name for it because naming things is pretty hard sometimes. Or it doesn't really need a name because the context of its use is kind of self-evident. For instance, in this case, I've got a variable called button, which might represent a HTML DOM element representing a button. And I want an onClick handler. So it had a property called onClick. I assigned this new function to it. So that's kind of weird. Basically, this declaration right here is an expression. It's a value. It produces a value, a reference to that function itself. So this function here will take in one parameter, and it will run this code right here, console.log.e. Now, oftentimes with click listeners and stuff, you'll just have one parameter right there. So any questions about this so far? It's okay to ask questions. So, functions can have return values. They can return things. They don't have to, but they can. Functions can have parameters. This allows you to change the output of the function based on parameters themselves. They don't have to have parameters. Functions have access to all available variables in scope. In this case, the only thing that they have access to would maybe be button. In this scope right here, the function would only have access to x, and x would be provided as a parameter. Outside of here, they wouldn't have access to x. Okay, so you don't have x here, and you don't have x here, but inside of this function, right there in the body, right there, you've got an x that you have access to. Furthermore, functions have a variable that you don't explicitly declare, and that's called this. This is oftentimes used to refer to the thing that is calling the function or the listener or handler that's attached to something like an HTML DOM element. So, when this button is clicked, if I would use this in this body, this would refer to the button. Now you're thinking, oh, that's a little awkward, so how does that really work? Well, the reason why you assign this is because really what they're doing is they're taking a function and they're using this call method on it. And the call method, it's basically like a function, and it takes a first parameter that's going to be this. So if this was a click listener, like a button, the button would be right here, and then any parameters would be here. So, we talked about functions, we talked about how we build them, but how do we use them? So this whole slide is about function application. Applying a function is to run a function. So, functions can be assigned, functions can be named, and they can be called. Here's an example where I've made an anonymous function of one parameter. It just doubles x, so 2 times x. It takes in one parameter of x, and I've assigned it to a variable called func. Right? So there's something funky about that, and I can call it anytime. Whereas if I just want to name it immediately, I can go function and give it a name and assign it there. But even if I made it this way, if I went var1 or if I went function1, I can still assign that function. That declares in the scope a variable with that name. That variable is that function itself. So I can make lonely func, and I can just have lonely func be equal to 1. So if you call lonely func with two parentheses around it, it's just going to return the value 1. It's going to act just like this function 1 here. It's actually the same function. Now, if you look on the next line, there's one slight difference other than the name difference. There's 2 parentheses here. This forces the application of the function. What it says is, hey JavaScript, you've got a variable called 1. Now I want you to treat it as a function and invoke it with an empty parameter list. That's what it does. It invokes it with an empty parameter list. So it goes and runs this stuff, and it goes return 1, and then a 1 pops up here, and it gets assigned to lonely value. So you can turn any variable into a function application just by adding parentheses after it. So here's an example. Here I define an anonymous function. It's basically tripling something, and I don't do anything to it. It's just in parentheses. Nothing happens. This is a function. That's a value. That's all it's got. If I add extra parentheses after it, it's going to apply these parameters to that function. So it's going to return 9 right here. This is pretty well the same as this call. So this is the same function, and I'm going .call. I'm giving it something for this. I put an undefined, just like the empty object, and I say 3. So these two are functionally equivalent. They're both going to return the value 9. Okay. So JavaScript is an object-oriented language, so they also allow you to call they allow you to basically call methods on functions themselves because they're kind of like objects. All right. If I want to call a 0 parameter function with call, I can just go 1.call, and I can give, say, undefined for this. Now, you might think, why are you doing all this weird stuff with this? Why is that relevant? Well, this is automatically set inside of the function, and oftentimes it will refer to the object that called the function itself. So sometimes you make objects, basically things that have attributes, things which are called properties, things that have methods. And this will usually represent the object that's calling it. Another semantic in JavaScript is that when you do listeners, like click listeners and that, this will be set to the HTML element that invoked that listener. Okay? So, how do we deal with this? Well, we have this defined in the scope of our function, so we can access it any way we want. So if I got this function called thisser, right, and I run it, what it's going to do is it's going to return window to me, in this case, because I'm in a browser. So the thing that invoked it was the JavaScript window. So this will be set to window. If I go thisser.call1, 1 is not the parameter that gets passed into thisser. 1 is what this is set to. So when it gets here, this will be 1, and it will say return this, so it will actually just return 1. So this is kind of a representation of who's calling you, and that's oftentimes used in methods. So any questions about this stuff? Right. You gotta watch out with this, because oftentimes it gets lost on you. If you assign one of your methods to another, to be a listener, this often gets lost. So what a lot of people do, they'll cache this, they'll go var that equals this. But I'm not really going to get too deep into that. Okay, so we're still on the topic of JavaScript, and we're still on the topic of functions, and now we're talking about scope. I talked about scope a little bit before, but I might not have been very clear. So, ignore the bad indentation there. It looked fine when it was in the markdown, or whatever. Here we're defining a variable, var variable, and it equals a string value. Okay, let's look at this function init. Init doesn't have any parameters. It's got no return value. Init says f equals globally available, don't do this. This f is globally available. When something is global in scope, it means everyone has access to it. So, f is accessible in this function. F is accessible in this function. F is accessible all throughout here. In fact, it kind of, the way JavaScript seems to work, it could have already existed. So, if I didn't assign anything to it, it'd be undefined. But if I've assigned something to it, everyone else can access that value that I've assigned to it.